The air split with silence before a scream of panic tore the dawn. Grass bent under the weight of hooves, trembling as if the earth itself fled. Thomas said, "The herd moves as one, yet none know who will fall first." A shadow leapt from the tall grass, fangs gleaming with hunger. A young calf stumbled, breath ragged, its tiny legs weak against the rush of survival. Helen said, "Life offers no warning, only the cruel test of speed and instinct." The lion's roar cut through the morning, primal and absolute. Dust filled the air, choking lungs as the herd stampeded blindly. The survivor's fate was no longer choice, only chance. Each heartbeat echoed the law of nature. Endure or vanish. Daniel gasped as the earth thundered beneath his small hooves. Helen said, "The young are weakest when the world asks the most." The herd rushed past, their eyes filled with terror, unwilling to glance back. Dust clung to their bodies like a shroud. Daniel stumbled again, chest heaving, as Marcus' growl grew closer. Thomas said, "Nature is merciless. It does not wait for stragglers." The pounding rhythm of survival left no space for hesitation, no time for rescue. In this moment, the calf's fragile breath was the loudest sound in the world. Marcus' body carved through the grass like a blade through silk. His mane bristled, glowing in fractured sunlight. Helen said, "Every movement is sharpened by hunger." Daniel, trembling, lurched forward, hooves slipping in churned earth. Thomas said, "A single mistake means extinction. One heartbeat too late means silence." The predator's growl rolled through the air, a sound that pierced bone. In this dance of survival, there were no heroes, only those who endured a fraction longer. The herd turned sharply, sweeping across the plain like a tide, leaving Daniel stranded. Helen said, "The herd protects only itself, never the one left behind." The young one bleated, voice cracked with fear, but the sound vanished beneath the thunder of hooves. Dust swallowed sight, cloaking predator and prey alike. Thomas said, "Isolation is the cruelest wound, for the weak stand alone against the inevitable." Daniel's eyes darted wildly, but no figure came to his side. Marcus broke through the veil of dust, a golden phantom bearing judgment. Daniel's body froze, muscles trembling as fear seized him. Helen said, "Nature does not argue, it delivers verdicts." The predator's claws raked the ground, tearing soil, sending fragments into the air. Thomas said, "Every breath narrows to a single decision, fight, flee, or fall." Daniel's chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, a heartbeat against thunder. The first strike had begun, and mercy was nowhere to be found. The stampede thinned to breath and ash, and Daniel staggered inside its fading noise. Grace pressed her flank to his, steady as rock in a burning river. Grace said, "Stay on my shadow and breathe." Evelyn cut a path with calm eyes and lifted chin. Evelyn said, "We move to the ridge, and we do not scatter." Daniel tasted dust and shame, but lifted his head. Daniel said, "I can keep up." Helen said, "Fragility begs for time the world refuses to lend." Thomas said, "Hope walks awkwardly, then learns its legs in fire." A vulture traced a black question over the sky. Grace said, "Your legs are truth, not wishes." Daniel leaned forward and chose to move. Heat shimmered and the ridge crawled nearer, a promise with teeth. Cole shouldered past Daniel with casual cruelty and a glance like flint. Cole said, "Keep up or drift." Grace stepped between them with a blade of silence. Evelyn said, "Order is survival, not vanity." Daniel felt the old wobble return and forced it down. Helen said, "Tender pride cracks before tender bone." Thomas said, "The herd keeps rhythm by forgetting names." Grace said, "Eyes forward, count your breaths to 10. Daniel counted dust, breath and heart, then found 11. The waterhole waited like a mirror with secrets, rimmed by cracked clay. Daniel lowered his muzzle and saw a shaking sky crowd his reflection. Grace said, "Drink, then listen." The wind turned and carried a scent like rust and thunder. Evelyn raised her head and read the invisible. Evelyn said, We leave before thirst makes us heavy. Helen said, comfort is a hook baited with sleep. Thomas said, predators eat minutes before they eat flesh. Daniel drank once more, then stepped back from the glittering trap. Grace said, good. The wind smiled with teeth. Evening leaned blue across the savannah, and the air cooled like a warning. Daniel's legs trembled, then steadied beneath Grace's shadow. Grace said, small steps, many never stop. The herd settled beneath an acacia that stitched stars through its thorns. Evelyn circled once and chose the watch. Evelyn said, sleep short and ready. Helen said, night is a teacher that charges in silence. Thomas said, the lesson is collected at dawn. A hyena laughed somewhere too near. Daniel curled tight and counted breath until counting became rest. Dawn bled over the horizon and painted bones on the grass. Daniel rose stiff, then taller, as if the sun lifted him by the spine. Grace said, today you choose faster. Evelyn read the ground and traced a route that dodged old violence. Evelyn said, we skirt the gully and the thorn belt. Helen said, courage is quiet when it's real. Thomas said, so is hunger. A shape lingered far off, a rumor written in gold and shadow. Grace said, eyes here. Daniel inhaled iron air and stepped into the day he wanted to keep. The sun hammered the plains until each shadow looked like a wound. Daniel's breath snagged, and the tremor in his legs betrayed his secret. Grace said, strength is borrowed until it is learned. Evelyn scouted ahead, her ears sharp as blades. Evelyn said, tracks, not ours, heavy and close. Cole snorted, a smirk dancing across his face. Cole said, predators circle weak calves first. Helen said, rivalry blooms where fear takes root. Thomas said, every extra breath is measured against claws. The silence that followed was louder than sound, an omen carved in dust. The herd slowed to graze, but tension hissed beneath each bite. Daniel tried to mimic calm, chewing dry stalks that cut his tongue. Marcus moved unseen, a ghost dragging hunger behind him. Grace whispered, eat, but keep eyes high. Evelyn's stance stiffened as she raised her head. Evelyn said, air smells of danger. Cole flicked his ears and laughed under his breath. Cole said, or maybe you're afraid of your own shadow. Helen said, pride blinds faster than dust in the wind. Thomas said, and dust clears, leaving teeth in view. The wind shifted and carried the sound of crows. Marcus prowled, mane brushing grass like fire. Daniel's ears twitched, his body frozen in the pause before panic. Grace pressed her muzzle to his shoulder. Grace said, stillness can save. Evelyn's voice was steel. Evelyn said, he is closer. Cole crept forward with bravado, daring the shadows. Cole said, then let him come. I am faster than him. Helen said, arrogance burns brighter than hunger. Thomas said, but hunger always outlives flame. Thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. The herd jolted at the phantom of storm, a trick of earth trembling under Marcus' charge. Daniel stumbled, as ground seemed alive. Grace said, run but breathe. Evelyn shouted, to the ridge. Cole darted sideways, eyes daring Daniel to falter. Cole said, keep up, little shadow. Helen said, the race is against time, not rivals. Thomas said, each step is a gamble paid in blood. Dust surged into the air, drowning sight and swallowing choice. The ridge loomed, black teeth biting into sky. Daniel gasped, body trembling, but he pushed forward. Grace said, legs remember what mind forgets. Evelyn kept her pace sharp, her voice cutting through chaos. Evelyn said, do not look back. Marcus' roar split the plain, echoing death. Cole slowed only to sneer. Cole said, he'll take the weakest first. Daniel's heart pounded, loud as thunder, but his hooves found rhythm. Helen said, fear bends but does not break when hope hides inside. Thomas said, tonight, survival bleeds into dawn. The chase cracked open, a truth buried in dust. Marcus moved with ferocity, but each stride carried a limp ribs pressing sharp beneath his hide. Grace said, "He tires, but tired fangs still draw blood." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, reading the path like scripture etched in earth. Evelyn said, "This is not pursuit. He is steering us." Cole's laugh cut like stone on bone. Cole said, "Even a cripple can choose which calf he eats." The herd shifted, unaware of the trap tightening. Shadows breathed beneath a ledge, and two cubs blinked from darkness. Their small eyes burned hunger into silence. Helen said, "The hunter feeds not himself but mouths behind him." Thomas said, "Mercy and need gnaw from the same bone." Daniel's fear bent strangely toward pity, his heart split between horror and ache. Grace said, "Compassion steadies, but it does not shield." Marcus lowered his head, turned, and drove them again toward the horizon. The wind veered, scattering dust and pulling scent away like ink diluted in water. Evelyn pivoted sharply into thorn scrub, her stride cutting against the grain of pursuit. Evelyn said, "Crosswind steals our names." Grace pressed her flank to Daniel, forcing him through jagged thorns that ripped hide but bought distance. Grace said, "Better blood on bark than blood on teeth." Marcus tracked, nostrils flaring but the gust muddied trails, his stride slowing as he searched. Mara stayed anchored to the ledge, her body a shield against flame and fang. The cubs whimpered like sparks of hunger in the silence. Helen said, "The prey writes its fate with weather when weapons fail." Thomas said, "Strategy is older than bone, sharper than hunger." Daniel grimaced at scratches along his sides, yet pressed forward, each step an oath whispered into dust and sky. Grace said, "Pain is proof that you are not done." The ground betrayed without warning. Evelyn's forelegs sank into a hidden burrow, her body pitching sideways with a crack of pain. Grace lunged, bracing her against collapse. Grace said, "Breathe, hold steady." Daniel froze, trembling, then stepped closer, pressing his shoulder like a sapling holding stone. Evelyn said, "Do not break the line. Move forward." Cole's eyes gleamed with something sharp, his hooves kicking dust as words dripped like venom. Cole said, "We can leave her. Better one than all." Grace's snarl cut sharper than thorns. Helen said, "Leadership bends before it kneels, and strength is often carried on fragile backs." Thomas said, "A lesson written in bone costs most dearly." Evelyn grit her teeth, wrenching her limb free with a hiss, blood dark against pale hide. Grace steadied her, and Daniel pressed forward, his heart heavy but his steps firmer than before. The herd reformed, but trust cracked like brittle bark. Cole drifted sideways, crowding Daniel with intent. His shoulders slammed, pushing Daniel into exposed ground. Cole said, "Faster, or you feed him." Dust swirled as Grace cut across, her frame blocking the calf. Grace said, "Not today, not you." Evelyn pushed forward despite her limp, every stride defiance against weakness. Marcus surged at the scent of division, claws digging earth, golden mane, a storm of fury. Daniel's chest heaved, heart rattling like a drum of bones. Helen said, "Betrayal runs quicker than rumor, and wounds deeper than hunger." Thomas said, "But loyalty can stand like stone when the sky collapses." Grace braced and Daniel steadied, and together they stitched the herd's rhythm tight against collapse. A storm teased the horizon, lightning stitching sky with silver threads. Wind caught grass and sparked flame, a fire running red across Savannah skin. Evelyn said, "Bare ground, head for the ash." Grace guided Daniel closer, her voice fierce. Grace said, "Stay on the black, not the blaze." Marcus halted, pacing the flames, then swung wide toward the ledge where Mara crouched with cubs. The lion's hunger split into duty, his roar carrying both fury and warning. Helen said, "The greatest predator wears no flesh but fire." Thomas said, "Flame chooses without malice, burn equally predator and prey." Heat licked Daniel's sides, each stride brushing fire's edge. Grace shouted, "Faster!" His legs burned but found rhythm. Behind them, the cubs cried softly, spared for now by distance the fire could not cross. The fire ran like a red river, and the ridge threw a black jaw against it. Daniel felt heat rake his sides and chose speed over dread. Grace said, "Follow my steps and never stop." Evelyn cut across the ash, reading gaps like doors. Evelyn said, "Left, then straight, then hard right." Marcus closed in, hunger whetted by smoke and panic. Cole drifted near Daniel, eyes bright with calculation. Cole said, "Lose the weight or lose the race." Helen said, "Fear sharpens teeth on the tender." Thomas said, "But courage bites without asking leave." Daniel stumbled, then found a faster rhythm. Grace said, "I am here." The flames hissed, and the sky turned bruised with storm. Wind shifted, and the herd's scent curled back like a hook. Marcus burst through smoke, his roar smothering distance. Daniel froze for a blink that cost a lifetime. Grace said, "Down and right." He dipped, but Cole slammed a shoulder and threw him wide. Cole said, "Keep up or be kept." Evelyn pivoted and broke the lane open with her body. Evelyn said, "Run through me, not around me." Helen said, "Sacrifice arrives disguised as instruction." Thomas said, "And choice is counted in heartbeats." Marcus lunged, claws carving earth, jaw yawning like a gate. Daniel leapt, legs remembering what fear forgot. The ground bucked under hooves as if the earth refused to hold still. Evelyn saw the line that would kill Daniel and stepped into it. Evelyn said, "Go now." Grace shoved Daniel through the opening, eyes burning. Marcus adjusted with brutal grace and chose the bigger prize. Helen said, "Predators weigh risk with a scale made of hunger." Thomas said, "Leaders spend themselves so the young can keep time." Cole hesitated, pride curdling into fear. Cole said, "This is madness." Evelyn charged straight at the roar, head low, body lean and unwavering. Daniel cried out, voice small but unbroken. Daniel said, "Come back." The wind carried his plea into fire. Evelyn cut across Marcus a path and drew him toward the stony lip of the ridge. Her hooves struck sparks, and her breath came like knives. Evelyn said, "Here." Marcus gathered himself and leapt, a son of teeth and muscle. Grace hauled Daniel into cover, every step a promise. Grace said, "Do not look back." Helen said, "Valor is quiet when it spends itself." Thomas said, "The price is written in dust and blood." Cole hovered at the edge, torn between safety and shame. Cole said, "She chose this." The ridge funneled sound into a single crash, and silence followed like a final bell. The clash was thunder with a heartbeat. Evelyn twisted at the last instant and gave Marcus stone instead of flesh. Claws raked rock, and blood flew dark in ember light. Evelyn said, "Now run." Marcus landed crooked, pain ripping a roar from his chest. Grace drove Daniel onward, hooves drumming a verdict against fear. Daniel said, "I will live this for her." Helen said, "Survival is a hymn sung through loss." Thomas said, "The line holds because one thread chose to break." Fire hissed softer, and the ridge swallowed echoes. Marcus limped toward the ledge where cubs waited, torn but unbroken. The night inhaled and did not exhale. Night thinned to a smear of gray, and the fire settled into breathless coals. Daniel moved along the ash line, each step a whisper of heat. Grace said, "Match my pace and keep your head." Evelyn limped but held her gaze level. Evelyn said, "We are not broken, only marked." Cole walked silent, pride dulled to quiet. Helen said, "After ruin, the world counts who remains." Thomas said, "The tally is carved in tendon and air." Wind shifted cool and carried away the smoke sting. Grace pressed her shoulder to Daniel and steadied his sway. Daniel said, "I can carry more than fear." A vulture circled, then drifted on, bored by resilience. The ridge darkened behind them like a closed book. Across the ridge, Marcus returned to the ledge and laid down the roar he had carried. Mara nuzzled the torn fur and read the wound like weather. Mara said, You came back with time, not meat. The cubs pressed tiny faces into his side and listened to the slow thunder of his chest. Marcus said, "Breathe and wait for tomorrow." Helen said, "Hunger is a clock that resets with dawn." Thomas said, "Mercy is only distance in another shape." The fire's edge cooled into harmless black. Wind combed the grass and erased the chase. The night folded quiet around a family that still had names. Morning broke clean and cold, and the herd tested its edges like a wound testing a scab. Evelyn set a pace that hurt but held. Evelyn said short strides, no waste. Daniel matched, jaw set against ache. Grace said, "You keep the line. I keep your breath." Cole drifted to the outer flank and watched the open side. Cole said, "I see what hunts gaps." Helen said, "Pride returns as service when it learns the price." Thomas said, "A rival can be a stitch if it holds." Shadows moved but did not choose. The rhythm found itself and kept. They crossed a field of bones the wind had polished. Horns pointed at the sky like questions no one would answer. Daniel slowed and looked, then kept moving. Grace said, "Remember, but do not stay." Evelyn stopped once and bowed her head. Evelyn said, "We walk because they cannot." Helen said, "After the verdict, the world resumes its breathing." Thomas said, "Memory is weight that must be worn light." A thin rain stitched the dust and drew the smell of green from ash. Hooves clicked, then softened, and the plain answered with promise. By midday, the grass lifted in fresh blades where fire had licked. Daniel tasted new sweetness and stood taller in his small frame. Grace said, "Eat, then move." Evelyn scanned the wind and allowed herself one long breath. Evelyn said, "This will hold a day." Far off, a roar rose and settled like thunder far beyond rain. Helen said, "The circle tightens, then widens, then tightens again." Thomas said, "Survival is not victory but duration." Daniel chewed, then raised his head and faced the open miles. The world did not bless him. It merely did not stop him. Dusk bled slowly into indigo, a sky heavy with memory. Daniel stood against the open plain, his small frame sharper than the silence. Grace pressed close, steady as a root. Grace said, "Your breath still beats here." Evelyn limped behind, her wound crusted but her gaze unbroken. Evelyn said, "We pass what we carry to those who follow." Cole hung at the flank, pride melted into something rawer. Cole said, "I walk now not against you, but with you." Helen said, "The herd moves as one, but the echo lives in those who falter and rise." Thomas said, "The echo is proof that the fragile can also endure." Daniel lifted his head, and the wind caught his scent and hurled it further than his hooves could ever reach. Night opened, not with comfort but with space wide enough for survival. Far from the herd, Marcus collapsed beside Mara beneath the ridge. His breath dragged heavy, his ribs cut by the chase. Mara leaned close and whispered into his torn mane. Mara said, "You return without meat, yet with time for them." The cubs pressed their small heads into his scarred chest, listening to the slow, thunderous drum. Marcus said, "Tomorrow I will rise, and tomorrow I will hunt again." Helen said, "Even wounded predators carry the silence of kings, for their scars are crowns invisible to prey." Thomas said, "Legacy is not written by victory, but by persistence through pain." Fire ash drifted, scattering into the wind like pages of a book unbound. Mara closed her eyes, and the night wrapped her family in shadow as the circle closed and widened once more. The herd pressed deeper into night, guided by moonlight that drew silver lines across the grass. Daniel matched pace, no longer stumbling, his legs remembering rhythm. Grace said, "You learn not by watching but by bleeding through the run." Evelyn limped, but every stride she made beat steady as a drum. Evelyn said, "A wound is not an end, it is a line you carry forward." Cole ranged along the herd's edge, his eyes sharp but no longer cruel. Cole said, "Tonight, I shield instead of taunt." Helen said, When silence returns, the fractured can find bond. Thomas said, rivals are mirrors, and sometimes mirrors defend what they reflect. Daniel moved quicker, every breath sharp, his chest lighter than the fear that once crushed it. The herd's steps became the earth's heart, unbroken, echoing forward into dark. They reached the river, its black water sliding under faint starlight like oil across stone. Daniel leaned to drink, his reflection trembling as ripples fractured his face. Daniel said, I am still here, though the world tried to erase me. Grace touched his flank, grounding him in silence. Grace said, if you stand, then you are enough. Evelyn bent slowly, her wound shadowed, and drank, watching blood fade beneath the surface. Evelyn said, the river does not remember, but it carries everything. Cole lingered back, his reflection shifting, no longer sharpened by arrogance. Helen said, survival does not crown, it allows. Thomas said, what it allows becomes the story retold. Daniel lifted his head, and the river's breath smelled of distance and fragile beginnings. The night fell into silence, infinite and sharp. Daniel stood on the ridge, small against the stars, yet unshaken. Grace said this day will be remembered, though no word is spoken. Evelyn steadied herself, her limp a banner, her eyes full of weight carried forward. Cole stood still, no taunt left, only a gaze sharpened by regret and renewal. Helen said, the last word of nature is not cruelty or kindness. Thomas said, it is only continuity. Daniel drew in one breath that burned, and then he released it into the dark. His cry split the night, high and defiant, fragile yet unyielding. The sound traveled, echoed, then vanished. In its absence lay the truth, the law of survival written again, eternal, unbroken, unforgettable.